In this video, we're going to talk about what's known as the labor productivity model. Another term that we'll use is the Ricardian model, because David Ricardo first developed this model of trade. This is something that you've actually already done, and I'm going to start by going through an example that's very similar to what you have already seen. So at the beginning, this will hopefully feel very familiar to you. It's the basic model where we think about why people trade or why two countries would trade, and it boils down to comparative advantage and understanding the difference between comparative advantage and absolute advantage. So let's get started. I'm going to use an example where we have two people, okay? And we can think about this as two countries, but let's start by thinking about just two people that at first aren't going to trade with each other. Then we're going to allow them to trade and see what happens. So we're going to have what I'm going to refer to as a farmer and a rancher. The farmer and the rancher each can produce two goods. We're going to have them produce meat and potatoes. I'm going to give you some information about how much meat and potatoes they can produce, and then we'll use those numbers throughout the example that we go through. So let's start by thinking about the number of minutes needed to make 1 ounce. So this is going to be minutes needed for 1 ounce. And we're going to be thinking about them making meat and potatoes. Let's start by thinking about our farmer. Then we'll do the rancher. Let's suppose that the farmer needs 60 minutes to produce an ounce of meat. So this is going to be 60 minutes. So it takes the farmer a full hour to produce an ounce of meat. Let's suppose it takes the farmer 15 minutes to produce an ounce of potatoes. And I don't want you to worry about what that looks like. Just think about, make it as simple as if the farmer simply thinks about making meat for an hour, and then at the end of that process, there's an ounce of meat. Okay, we don't need to worry about any tools or inputs or anything. It's just time is going to be the input. Labor is going to be the input here. Now let's think about how much time the rancher needs to make meat and potatoes. Let's suppose that the rancher needs 20 minutes to make an ounce of meat. So the rancher here clearly is quicker at making meat than the farmer is. Okay? Let's suppose the rancher needs 10 minutes to make an ounce of potatoes. So in terms of both meat and potatoes, the rancher can make meat and potatoes faster than the farmer. And you might think about that as the rancher being more productive. Now, hopefully you know that what this tells us is that the rancher has the absolute advantage over the farmer in production of both meat and potatoes. But hopefully you also remember, and we'll review this, that that doesn't really matter. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert that into a day's work. Okay? So let's think about the amount produced in 8 hours. Amount produced in 8 hours. Now, the choice of how many hours, that doesn't matter, okay? We're going to think about that as just being some arbitrary number. What we'll see is that these are the numbers that really matter, but this helps us kind of think about the example and make it more concrete. So let's have meat here, potatoes. If the farmer needs 60 minutes to produce an ounce of meat and spends all 8 hours producing meat, then at the end of the day, the farmer would have 8 ounces of meat. If the farmer spends or needs 15 minutes to produce an ounce of potatoes, that means that in each hour can produce 4 ounces, and if the farmer works 8 hours, can produce 32 ounces. The rancher needs 20 minutes to produce an ounce of meat. That means the rancher can produce 3 ounces of meat every hour, and in 8 hours could produce 24 ounces. The rancher needs 10 minutes to produce an ounce of potatoes. That means the rancher can produce 6 ounces every hour. And if the rancher spends 8 hours producing potatoes, that would be 48 ounces. So that table gives us the amount of time, or the amount of meat and potatoes that the farmer and the rancher could produce if they spent all of their time making meat or making potatoes. Now again, the choice of 8 hours is completely arbitrary. We could make that a 40-hour work week. We could make it 1 hour. It doesn't matter. We'll see that that's not really that important. Now let's start by thinking about what happens if the farmer and the rancher do not trade with each other. And in international economics, that situation where there's no trade, that's referred to as autarky. So we're going to start by thinking about the autarky situation. The farmer, whatever the farmer wants to consume, the farmer is going to have to produce themselves. Same with the rancher. Once they start trading, then they're able to consume a bundle of meat and potatoes that is not the same bundle that they produced. So we'll start by thinking about them not trading. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to think about what the PPF, the production possibilities frontier, looks like for both the farmer and the rancher. And you've drawn a production possibilities frontier before. Let's start by drawing the farmer's production possibilities frontier. So we're going to put on our vertical axis, for this example, we're going to put meat. And on our horizontal axis, we're going to put potatoes. And the numbers that we have here in our table are going to give us the endpoints of the farmer's production possibilities frontier. So remember that a PPF tells us all of the possible combinations of our two goods, meat and potatoes, that the farmer is able to produce. If the farmer spends all of their time making meat, they can make 8 ounces. So we'll put that right here. There's 8 ounces of meat. That's going to be a point on the farmer's production possibilities frontier. Now, if the farmer spends all 8 hours making meat, that means there's no hours left over to make potatoes. So this point has coordinates 8 ounces of meat, 0 ounces of potatoes. On the other hand, the farmer could spend all of their time making potatoes, and in that case would have 32 ounces. So here's another point on the farmer's production possibilities frontier. And if we connect those, we get the full production possibilities frontier. So this is the farmer's PPF. The farmer could spend all of their time making meat and be at this point, or spend all of their time making potatoes and be at that point. Or they could spend any combination of 8 hours making meat and potatoes and be at any other point on this production possibilities frontier. They're also capable of producing any point inside the PPF, but that would be inefficient. They've got 8 hours to work. They want to consume the largest bundle of meat and potatoes that they can, and so they're going to be on that production possibilities frontier. Let's just arbitrarily pick a point for them to start with, and let's suppose that the farmer spends half of their day making meat, the other half making potatoes. In that case, they would have 4 ounces of meat and 16 ounces of potatoes. That would be a point right here in the middle of the production possibilities frontier. So that point has coordinates 4 ounces of meat, 16 ounces of potatoes. Let's label that point A. Now that's just an arbitrary choice, and it doesn't really matter which point we start with. We just need a starting point, and that's a convenient one. So we're going to think about that as being the starting point for our farmer. Now let's draw the rancher's production possibilities frontier. And it's going to be similar, except clearly the endpoints are going to be different. Let's put that one right over here. Let's put it so that we can compare. We're going to also put meat on the vertical axis, potatoes on the horizontal axis. The choice of which good you put on the vertical and horizontal axis is purely up to you. It doesn't matter. If the rancher, let's label this one farmer, and this one will be our rancher. If we look at how much meat the rancher can produce, if the rancher spends all of their time making meat, they can produce 24 ounces. So that's going to be some point up here. I'm not worried about the comparison of this vertical distance with that vertical distance. I know it's not to scale, but that does not matter. The other endpoint of the rancher's production possibilities frontier is going to be 48 ounces of potatoes. So we're going to stick that one somewhere out here. So there's the rancher's production possibilities frontier. Let's also do the same thing for the rancher that we did for the farmer. Let's suppose that the rancher spends half of their time making meat, half of their time making potatoes. That will put them right here at the midpoint of that production possibilities frontier, where at the end of the day, they have 12 ounces of meat and 24 ounces of potatoes. We'll label that point A. And so now we've got a place that we can start from. Now we can see the situation that the farmer and the rancher are in if they do not trade with each other. We'll be able to allow them to trade and then see what situation that puts them in. Let's start by thinking about the fact that if they do not trade, then whatever they want to consume, they have to be able to produce. The production possibility frontier tells us what they're capable of producing. And so in this autarky situation, this production possibilities frontier is also their consumption possibilities frontier. So if we think about the rancher is going to be able to consume any point on this PPF. They could consume all meat one day and no potatoes, or all potatoes and no meat, or 12 ounces of meat and 24 ounces of potatoes, or any point on that production possibilities frontier, but they're not going to be able to get outside of that production possibilities frontier. There's no possible way for them to achieve a point, say, out here. Okay? Same for the farmer. We also see that the rancher's production possibilities frontier is farther out in this direction. It's farther away from the origin than the farmer's is. And you already probably know that that just represents the fact that the rancher has the absolute advantage over the farmer in terms of producing both meat and potatoes. So we can see absolute advantage from that table over there, where we've got 8 ounces of meat versus 24 ounces of meat, or 32 ounces of potatoes versus 48 ounces of potatoes. Or we can see absolute advantage from the fact that the end point for the farmer here is higher, or excuse me, for the rancher is higher than the farmer's end point. Also in that direction, the rancher's end point is farther out than the farmer's. What we want to do now is we want to think about what happens when they're allowed to trade. And what we'll see, what you know we're going to see, is that trade is going to allow them to achieve a consumption point outside of their production possibilities frontier. What I need to do is take a break and kind of redraw this and organize it over there. So I'll do that and then be back in a second. So now we've got our production possibility frontiers for the rancher and the farmer kind of redrawn there. I'm going to create another table right down here where we summarize the production and consumption for both the farmer and the rancher. So let's start by I'm going to put my farmer on the left and my rancher here. We're going to think about the amount of meat and potatoes that each of them both produces and consumes. So we're going to have meat, potatoes for each of them. And we're going to start with this autarky situation. So let's put up here the amount of meat and potatoes that they each produce when there's no trade. Now, those points are represented by point A in each of our pictures. So for our farmer, the farmer at the end of each day has 4 ounces of meat and 16 ounces of potatoes. Our rancher has 12 ounces of meat and 24 ounces of potatoes. So that's the situation with no trade. And remember that when they're not trading, their production and consumption points have to be the same. Once they start trading, that's no longer going to be true. So I'm going to draw a little line here just to represent this no trade situation from what happens when we allow them to trade with each other. So now let's suppose that the rancher goes to the farmer and proposes a way that they can cooperate with each other, change what they produce, and then engage in a trade. And the rancher tells the farmer that this is going to allow both of them to be better off. And probably if you're the farmer, at first you would be skeptical that that's true, because again, a lot of people believe that the world is a zero-sum game. So the farmer might be worried at first that the rancher is going to take advantage of them. But let's suppose that they sit down and they listen to the rancher's plan. And what the rancher's plan involves is each of them changing their production point and then engaging in a trade. So let's suppose that we think about first the production points. Let's suppose that the farmer is going to specialize completely in producing potatoes. So instead of producing at point A, the farmer is going to move down here to this point. We'll call it point B. And that's going to be the farmer's new production point. The rancher, on the other hand, so the farmer each day is going to produce 32 ounces of potatoes, no meat. Now that obviously at the end of the day is going to leave the farmer with a bunch of potatoes and no meat, but we're going to see that the second part of the rancher's plan is that they engage in a trade. So the rancher is going to move to this point, point B. The rancher's not going to specialize completely in meat, but they're going to move in that direction. So if the rancher moves to point B, let's suppose point B is a point where the rancher produces, say, 18 ounces of meat and 12 ounces of potatoes. So those are our new production points. So the farmer's going to move towards production of potatoes, the rancher's going to move towards production of meat. Then they're going to trade, and the trade, let's put our trade up here. The trade is going to be the farmer is going to give the rancher 15 ounces of potatoes in return for 5 ounces of meat. So it's going to be 15 ounces of potatoes for 5 ounces of meat. Now we can think about that trade from either person's perspective. Essentially, the farmer, because the farmer is only producing potatoes, the farmer is going to pay for 5 ounces of meat with 15 ounces of potatoes. The rancher is going to be producing mostly meat and very little potatoes, so the rancher is going to be paying 5 ounces of meat for 15 ounces of potatoes. Okay? So it depends on whose perspective you're looking at. They're just mirror images of each other. Now let's think about what that looks like in our table here. So now we're going to put the situation with trade. So let's start by thinking about production. And we're going to put points B up here. So in terms of the farmer is now going to be producing 0 ounces of meat and 32 ounces of potatoes. Our rancher is going to be producing 18 ounces of meat and 12 ounces of potatoes. So that's what production looks like. So now let's add to our table the trade that we've got up here. So the farmer is producing no meat, 0 ounces of meat, but is going to get 5 ounces of meat in the trade. So here's the trade. The farmer is going to get 5 ounces of meat. In terms of potatoes, the farmer is going to be producing 32 ounces of potatoes, but is going to trade 15 ounces of them away. So this is going to be minus 15 ounces. Okay. From the rancher's perspective, it's going to be the opposite here. The rancher is going to be producing 18 ounces of meat, but is going to trade 5 of them away. So this is losing 5 ounces, but what they're going to get for the 5 ounces of meat is 15 ounces of potatoes. So this is plus 15. So there's our trade. Now let's think about how that trade leaves them at the end of the day. Let's think about their consumption point. So our farmer produces 0 ounces of meat, but gets 5 ounces of meat in the trade. So at the end of the day, the farmer has 5 ounces of meat. That's 1 more ounce of meat than they had when they were producing and consuming at point A. The farmer is producing 32 ounces of potatoes, but trading 15 ounces away. That leaves them with 17 ounces of potatoes at the end of the day. So now let's put this consumption point on the farmer's production possibilities frontier. This consumption point is 5 ounces of meat and 17 ounces of potatoes. So 5 ounces of meat, 17 ounces of potatoes, that's a point right out here, outside of the production possibilities frontier for the farmer. We'll call that point C. That's their consumption point. So we can see that by engaging in this trade with the rancher, the farmer is able to reach a consumption point that's better than what they could have produced themselves. But now that's probably not surprising because the farmer is the least productive person out of the two. What we need to do is see where this trade leaves the rancher. So let's think about meat production. The rancher produces 18 ounces of meat, trades away 5 of them. That leaves the rancher with 13 ounces of meat at the end of the day. The rancher produces 12 ounces of potatoes and gets another 15 in the trade. So that leaves the rancher with 27 ounces of potatoes at the end of the day. So in terms of the rancher's consumption point, that's 13 ounces of meat, 27 ounces of potatoes. So that's a point right out here. There's the rancher's consumption point, and we can see here that the rancher gets even farther outside of their production possibilities frontier than the farmer did, which for a lot of people is counterintuitive because the rancher is the more productive person and the rancher is trading with a less productive person. So for a lot of people that makes them feel as if the rancher is not going to be able to be better off by trading with a less productive person. But we can see that clearly they are better off. They're even better off than the farmer is. Let's look now at the gains from trade. So if we think about the gains, and we're going to be comparing this consumption line with the no trade, the autarky consumption line, which is right up here. So in terms of the gains from trade, we can see that here there's 1 extra ounce of meat that the farmer is consuming. There's also an extra ounce of potatoes. In terms of the rancher, we see that there's an extra ounce of meat. And in terms of potatoes, there's 3 extra ounces of potatoes. So if we look at total meat and potato production in the world here, our simple world that includes only the farmer and the rancher, we can see that at the end of this process of changing how they produce and then engaging in this trade, there's 2 extra ounces of meat and 4 extra ounces of potatoes in the world. The economic pie has gotten bigger. There's more meat and potatoes to go around, and consequently, both the farmer and the rancher are able to consume at a point that they could not have reached by themselves. So this represents the gains from trade. If we want to understand where these gains from trade come from, remember that it's important to keep in mind the difference between absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So what you hopefully already know is that the rancher has the absolute advantage in production of both meat and potatoes over the farmer. What has happened here, though, is that that's not what's important. What's happened is that by engaging in a trade with each other, both the rancher and the farmer are able to specialize in the good for which they have the comparative advantage. So comparative advantage has to do with opportunity cost. Absolute advantage, the definition of absolute advantage is that a producer has an absolute advantage if they require less of the input to produce a unit of the good. Another way to think about that definition is that a producer has an absolute advantage if, using the same amount of input, they can produce more of the good. So clearly the rancher has the absolute advantage in production of both meat and potatoes. In an 8-hour day, the rancher could produce more meat or more potatoes than the farmer. But what really matters is not the amount of time needed to make meat or the amount of time needed to make potatoes. What matters is the actual opportunity cost. Because any minute spent making potatoes is a minute that can't be spent making meat. And that's when you get the opportunity cost. Remember, the number of minutes is just an intermediate step. What really matters when you make an ounce of potatoes is how much less meat can you produce. Not how many minutes it takes you, but what's the actual cost in terms of the other good. Now, hopefully you remember that the opportunity cost is represented by the slope of this production possibilities frontier. So we can easily get the opportunity cost of producing potatoes and producing meat for each of the 2 people we've got here. So let's put together a little table here that represents the opportunity cost of producing meat and potatoes for both the farmer and the rancher. So let's talk about the opportunity cost of, we'll start here with 1 ounce of meat, and then we'll do 1 ounce of potatoes. We'll do it for the farmer and the rancher. So let's start with our farmer. And I'm actually going to start with the opportunity cost of 1 ounce of potatoes, because remember that the opportunity cost of the good on the horizontal axis is represented by the slope of that production possibilities frontier. So the slope of this PPF is 1/4. You can think about that as this vertical distance divided by that horizontal distance. It's going to be 8/32, which is 1/4. So for the farmer, the opportunity cost of the good on the horizontal axis, potatoes, is going to be 1/4 ounce of meat. The opportunity cost of the good on the vertical axis, in this case meat, is going to be the reciprocal of the slope. So all we have to do is take this number, take the reciprocal of it, which would be 4. So now we get the opportunity cost of 1 ounce of meat is 4 ounces of potatoes. So there's our opportunity cost for the farmer. Let's talk about the rancher now. So if we want the opportunity cost for an ounce of potatoes for the rancher, it's going to be equal to the slope of this production possibilities frontier. 24 over 48 is 1/2, and so we see that for the rancher, the opportunity cost of an ounce of potatoes is going to be 1/2 ounce of meat. The opportunity cost for the rancher for meat is the reciprocal of this slope of the PPF, so it's going to be 2 ounces of potatoes. So now we know the actual cost in terms of the other good, not in terms of minutes, in terms of the other good. We can see what producing an ounce of meat costs each of these people. The farmer only has to give up a 1/4 ounce of meat to produce a single ounce of potatoes. The rancher has to produce or give up a full 1/2 ounce of meat. So in terms of who has the smaller opportunity cost for producing potatoes, it's the farmer. In terms of meat production, for the farmer to produce an ounce of meat, they have to give up 4 ounces of potatoes. The rancher only has to give up 2 ounces of potatoes. So the rancher has the smaller opportunity cost for production of an ounce of meat. So now we see that in terms of the actual cost of production, the farmer has a lower cost of production for potatoes than the rancher does. And in terms of production of meat, the rancher has a smaller opportunity cost. And that's why this trade that the rancher proposed involved the farmer moving to this point where they produce the good for which they have the lower opportunity cost. In other words, they produce the good for which they have the comparative advantage. And the rancher moving towards meat production because they have the comparative advantage in the production of meat. So we can see here that trade has allowed each of them to specialize in the good for which they have the comparative advantage. In other words, they're specializing in the good that they're most efficient at producing. Now, one thing that we have to keep in mind that you know from your principles class is that it's impossible for one of these people to have the comparative advantage in both goods, because there's no possible way that the slope could be smaller in both directions for the farmer or for the rancher. So if the rancher has the comparative advantage in one good, the farmer's going to have the comparative advantage in the other good, and vice versa. So it's impossible to have the comparative advantage in both. The other side of that coin is that it's impossible to have the comparative advantage in neither. You have to have a comparative advantage in something. So let's think about the price that's implied by this trade and why that trade works. But in order to do that, what we're going to need to do is erase the board one more time and kind of reorganize some material. So let me do that. Okay, so let's think about the trade that the rancher proposed and think about the price that's implied by that trade. And we're going to use this table that we've got of the opportunity costs of each of the good for each person to help us understand why that trade created the gains. So let's think about starting with our farmer. So let's take the farmer's perspective and let's look at the price that the farmer is paying for the meat that they're getting. So the farmer got 5 ounces of meat. That was what they received, and they paid 15 ounces of potatoes. So they got 5 ounces of meat for 15 ounces of potatoes. Now let's think about the price that they would have paid for 1 ounce of meat. So they got 5 ounces of meat for 15 ounces of potatoes. That means they got each ounce of meat for 3 ounces of potatoes. So they got 1 ounce of meat for 3 ounces of potatoes. And if you're not sure how I did that, I've got 5 here. If I want to convert that to a 1, I need to divide it by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. But if I'm going to divide that by 5, I also have to divide that by 5. And 15 divided by 5 is 3. So from the farmer's perspective, they got each ounce of meat for 3 ounces of potatoes. And let's think about why that is a good deal from their perspective. If the farmer would have produced an ounce of meat, it would have cost the farmer 4 ounces of potatoes to produce it. They're able to get each ounce of meat for 3 ounces of potatoes. Okay? Let's also think about that trade from the rancher's perspective. Why does the rancher like this price of 3 ounces of potatoes for each ounce of meat? Well, the rancher is the one selling the meat. The rancher is able to produce each ounce of meat for 2 ounces of potatoes and then sell it for 3 ounces of potatoes. They gain from that transaction. So both of them like this trade because it implies a price that falls right in between their opportunity costs. Okay? The buyer is able to buy it for a price that's less than what they would have had to pay if they produced it themselves, and the seller is able to sell it for a price that's higher than what it costs them to produce. Let's think about it from the rancher's perspective. So the rancher's perspective is that they got 15 ounces of potatoes for 5 ounces of meat. We want to put that in terms of how much each ounce of potatoes cost the rancher, so that we can rewrite that as they got each ounce of meat, got 1 ounce of meat, or excuse me, 1 ounce of potatoes for 1/3 ounce of meat. And I did the same thing there. I've got a 15, but I want to turn that into a 1. So I need to divide it by 15. But I also have to divide that by 15, and 5 divided by 15 is 1/3. So the rancher got each ounce of potatoes and paid a price of 1/3 ounce of meat. Now let's think about why the rancher likes that. Well, the rancher likes that because if they would have produced that ounce of potatoes themselves, they would have had to have paid a full 1/2 ounce of meat. All they had to pay was 1/3 ounce of meat. The farmer also likes that because the farmer's the one selling the potatoes, and they're able to produce them for a 1/2 ounce of, or excuse me, for a 1/4 ounce of meat and then sell it for a 1/3 ounce. So they're able to gain. Both of them are made better off by that transaction. And clearly, any trade that implies a price that falls in this range is also going to fall in that range because these are reciprocals of each other. So now we have a good sense, hopefully, of that farmer-rancher two-person trade model. We've seen that trade allows each of them to specialize in the good for which they have the comparative advantage. We see that when they do that, they're able to achieve a point outside of their production possibilities frontier, which represents the gains that they get from trading with each other. What we want to do now is we want to talk about this model in more general terms. This is a model known as the Ricardian model. And so what I'm going to do now is develop this model more generally. I'm going to give you a symbolic representation of this model, but I want you to keep in mind that all we're doing is exactly what we did here. Once I get the model developed and we think about how it works, how it looks symbolically, then we'll go through a numerical example that's similar to this one, and we'll see that it's actually very simple. So we'll do that in our next video.